Assalamu alaikum, adab, good morning, namaskar, sat sri akal. My name is Sayyid Kasfar Abbas. Today, I'm going to talk about United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Definition and explanation. More people globally are expected to join the middle class over the next 2 decades. These socioeconomic and demographic changes are good for individual prosperity, but will increase demand for already constrained natural resources. Societies need to find just and equitable ways to meet individual needs and aspirations within the ecological limits of the planet. Sustainable practices in the production phase of products and services will not provide sufficient responses to meet science based emission reduction targets. Natural resource constraints are the growing demand for basic needs such as food, water, and sanitation, and access to energy. Furthermore, demand for materials will likely outpace efficiency gains in supply chains as well as overwhelm already stretched ecosystem services. Consumption patterns need to be made sustainable, particularly lifestyles in industrialized societies, and reduce their ecological footprint to allow for the regeneration of natural resources on which human life and biodiversity depend. It is in the interest of business to find new solutions and enable sustainable consumption and production patterns. A better understanding of environmental and social impacts of products and services is needed, both of product life cycle and how these are affected by use within lifestyles. Identifying hotspots within the value chain where interventions have the greatest potential to improve the environmental and social impact of the system as a whole is, is a crucial first step. Business can use its innovative power to then design appropriate solutions that can both enable and inspire individuals to lead more sustainable lifestyles, reducing impacts and improving well being. The major areas needing close monitoring and remedies. A. World continue to use natural resources unsustainably. Global material footprint being 73.2 billion tons in 2010 increased to 85.9 billion tons in 2017. From 2010 to 2019, electronic waste grew by 38%, but only less than 20% is recycled. C. Rising fossil fuel subsidies are contributing to the climate crisis, being US 318 billions in 2015 to 427 billions in 2018. D. Around one third of the globally produced food is lost in supply chains, that is harvesting, transport, storage, and processing, as reported by UN Food and Agriculture Organization in 2014. Key business themes addressed by this SDG. These business themes should at least be addressed by this SDG. A. Sustainable sourcing. B. Resource efficiency of products and services. C. Materials recycling. D. Procurement practices. E. Product and service information and labeling. Examples of key business actions and solutions. The below examples are non-exhaustive and some may be more relevant to certain industries than to others. A. Implement product portfolio analysis tools to understand environmental and social footprint of products within lifestyles as well as production. Innovation must align the products and applications to appropriately address sustainability mega trends. B. Develop innovative business models such as moving from selling products to selling services to retain ownership of the product and help close the material loop. C. Enable sustainable consumption by developing innovative solutions can reduce energy need in usage and educate consumers about these benefits. D. Reduce manufacturing impacts by substituting virgin raw materials in products with post-consumer materials through recycling and upcycling. E. Apply modular design so products constitute the parts will be easily separated and either reused without further processing or easily recycled near the point of disposal. F. Significantly reduce waste and ensure that any unavoidable waste is utilized to the fullest degree. For example, organic waste as fuel or fertilizer or food. Food losses and waste. It is estimated by United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization that roughly 30% of global food production, that is 40 to 50% of root crops, fruits, vegetables, 20% of oil seeds, meat and dairy products, and 35% of fish is either lost or wasted. This amounts to some 1.3 billion tons, or enough food to feed 2 billion people. World is projected to hold nearly 10 billion people by 2050. Sustainably feeding this exploding population requires meeting three great needs simultaneously. According to World Resource Institute WRI research, the world will have to close a gap of 56% between the amount of food available today and that required by 2050. It must reduce agriculture's impact on climate, ecosystems, and water. And it needs to ensure that agriculture supports inclusive economic and social development. WRI's World Resource Report project has identified a five-course menu of solutions to the world food production and consumption problems. We identify ways to reduce food loss and waste. We analyze strategies to sustainably increase food production, such as restoring degraded lands back into productivity, increasing pasture land yields, and improving land and water management. And we advance methods to reduce food production's impact on the environment, such as climate smart agriculture. As the global population grows from 7 billion in 2010 to the projected 9.8 billion in 2050, and incomes grow across the developing world, overall food demand is on course to increase by more than 50%, and demand for animal-based foods by nearly 70%. Yet today, hundreds of millions of people remain hungry. Agriculture already uses almost half of the world's vegetated land, and agriculture and related land use change generate 1/4 of annual greenhouse gas emissions. WRI synthesis report published in December 2018 proposes a menu of options that could allow the world to achieve a sustainable food future by meeting growing demands for food, avoiding deforestation, and reforesting or restoring abundant and unproductive land, and in ways that help stabilize the climate, promote economic development, and reduce poverty. Achieving these goals requires closing these three gaps by 2050. A. The food gap. The difference between the amount of food produced in 2010 and the amount necessary to meet likely demand in 2050. We estimate this gap to be 7,400 trillion calories, or 56% more crop calories that were produced in 2010. B. The land gap. The difference between global agricultural land area in 2010 and the area required in 2050, even if crop and pasture yields continue to grow at past rates. We estimate this gap to be 593 million hectares, an area nearly twice the size of India. C. The greenhouse gas mitigation gap. The difference between the annual greenhouse gas emissions likely from agriculture and land use change in 2050, which would estimate to be 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and target of 4 gigatons that represent agriculture's proportional contribution to holding global warming below 2 degrees centigrade, above pre-industrial temperatures. We therefore estimate this gap to be 11 gigatons. Holding warming below at 1.5 degrees centigrade increase would require meeting the 4 gigaton target plus reforesting hundreds of millions of hectares of liberated agricultural land. This synthesis report explores a 22-item menu for a sustainable food future, which is divided into 5 courses that together could close these gaps. Number one, reduced growth in demand for food and agriculture products. Number two, increase food production without expanding agriculture land. Number three, exploit reduced demand on agriculture land to protect and restore forest, savannas, and peatlands. Number four, increase fish supply through improved wild fisheries management and aquaculture. And five, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture production. On the other hand, the scope of potential solutions is often underestimated. Prior analyses have generally not focused on the promising opportunities for technological innovation and have often underestimated the large social, economic, and environmental co-benefits. Our menu is detailed, but several themes stand out. A. Raise productivity. Increased efficiency of natural resource use is the single most important step toward meeting both food production and environmental goals. This means increasing crop yields at higher than historical linear rates and dramatically increasing output of milk and meat per hectare of pasture, per animal, particularly cattle, and per kilogram of fertilizer. If today's level of production efficiency were to remain constant through 2050, then feeding the planet would entail clearing most of the world's remaining forests, wiping out thousands more species, and releasing enough greenhouse gas emissions to exceed the 1.5 degree Charlie and 2 degree Charlie warming targets enshrined in the Paris Agreement, even if emissions from all other human activities were entirely eliminated. B. Manage demand. Closing the food gap will be more difficult if we cannot slow the rate of growth in demand. Slowing demand growth requires reducing food loss and waste, shifting the diets from high meat consumers towards plant based foods, avoiding any further expansion of biofuel production, and improving women's access to education and healthcare in Africa to accelerate voluntary reductions in infertility levels. C. Link agricultural intensification with natural ecosystem protection. Agriculture land area is not merely expanding but shifting from one region to another. For example, from temperate areas to the tropics and within regions. The resulting land use changes increase greenhouse gas emissions and loss of biodiversity. To ensure that food production is increased through yield growth, intensification, and not expansion, and productivity gains do not encourage more shifting, governments must explicitly link efforts to boost crop and pasture yields with legal protection of forest, savannas, and peatlands from conversion to agriculture. D. Moderate ruminant meat consumption. Ruminant livestock, cattle, sheep, and goats use two-thirds of global agriculture land and contribute roughly half of the agriculture's production-related emissions. Ruminant meat demand is projected to grow by 88% between 2010 and 2050. Yet, even in the United States, ruminant meats, mostly beef, provide only 3% of the calories. Closing the land and greenhouse gas emission mitigation gaps require that by 2050, the 20% of the world population who would otherwise be high ruminant meat consumers reduce their average consumption by 40% relative to their consumption in 2010. E. Target reforestation and peatland restoration. Rewetting lightly farmed drained peatlands that occupy only around 0.3% of global agricultural lands provides a necessary and cost-effective step towards climate change mitigation, as does reforesting some marginal and hard to improve grazing lands. reforestation at a scale necessary to hold temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is hundreds of millions of hectares, is potentially achievable, but only if the world succeeds in reducing projected growth in demand for resource intensive agriculture products and boosting crop and livestock yields. F. Require production related climate mitigation. Management measures exist to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture production sources, particularly enteric fermentation by ruminants, manure, nitrogen fertilizers, and energy use. These measures require a variety of incentives and regulations deployed at scale. Implementation will require far more detailed analysis and tracking of agriculture production systems within countries. G. Spur technological innovation. Fully closing the gaps requires many innovations. Fortunately, researchers have demonstrated good potential in every necessary area. Opportunities include crop traits or additives that reduce methane emissions from rice and cattle, improved fertilizers, farms, and crop properties that reduce nitrogen runoff, solar based processes for making fertilizers, organic sprays that preserve fresh food for longer periods, and plant based beef substitutes. A revolution in molecular biology opens up new opportunities for crop breeding. Progress at the necessary scale requires a large increase in R&D funding and flexible regulations that encourage private industry to develop and market new technologies. Islamic Perspective on SDG 12. Sustainable consumption and production is about promoting resource efficiency and a better quality of life for all. It aims at doing more and better with less. Net welfare gains from economic activities can increase by reducing resource use, degradation, and pollution along the whole life cycle, while increasing quality of life. In the following verses, the Quran calls on human beings to be responsible as a consumer and a producer and cease to contribute to resource shortage. Verses of Quran also clearly highlight the importance of responsible behavior and avoiding wastefulness. But waste not by excess, for Allah loveth not the wasters. Surah Al-An'am, Ayah 141. Eat and drink, but waste not by excess. Verily, he loves not the excessive. Surah Al-Araf, Ayah 31. And give the relative his right, and also the poor and the traveler, and do not spend wastefully. Surah Al-Isra, Ayah 26. And they are those who, when they spend, do not excessively or sparingly, but are ever between that justly moderate. Surah Al-Furqan, Ayah 67. I will refer here to an article written by a fellow at IKIM, Institute Kefahaman Islam Malaysia, Susanna MD Samsuri, in May 2017. Sustainable consumption and production, SCP, represents one of the key target goals of United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The United Nations Environment Programme defines SCP as a holistic approach in minimizing the negative environmental impacts from consumption and production systems while promoting quality of life for all. Resource or economic efficiency, however, can only be made possible if consumers demand sustainable products. From the demand or consumer side, the objective of SCP is to meet the consumption needs of the poor and low income groups, as well as managing the overconsumption issues among higher income societies. Research into the influence of values in sustainable consumption in the past decade suggests that a paradigm shift is needed within a society in order for a sustainable economy to take place. This includes the shift of values from self centered to self sacrificing, from material to spiritual, and from cultural to an ecological consumption culture. A consumption culture characterized by self-sacrificing spiritual and ecological values is indeed in line with Islamic values. Contrary to modern thinking in addressing environmental degradation as an ecological crisis, some Muslim scholars and activists have framed it as a spiritual crisis. For example, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who can be considered as the founding father of Islamic eco-theology, wrote a book titled Man and Nature, the Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man in 1967 to address the issue of concern. Recognizing that the ecological crisis is not a crisis by itself, but instead a reflection of a spiritual crisis. The approaches in dealing with the environmental situation will be different. The focus will be on the individual spirituality to fight against worldly lusts rather than working solely on the outer material world. Sustainable consumption progress for the UN Sustainability Agenda, for instance, is measured based on domestic material consumption, which accounts for the amount of natural resources used in economic processes. Hence, what governs consumption behavior will be policies to incentivize the extrinsic rather than intrinsic consumer motivation. Intrinsic consumer motivation symbolizes one's spiritual consumption that leads to happiness. In Islam, ethics and spirituality, including environmental ethics, are guided based on the sources of divine revelations in Quran and the authentic collection of hadith. Sustainability in the Islamic worldview recognizes Allah as Al-Razaq, or the sustainer. Quran, ayah 51-58. The Quran further describes humankind as the Khalifa or vicegerent of Allah on the earth. Quran, ayah 2-30. Thus, environmental stewardship has in fact been divinely mandated to human beings from the very beginning of human existence on the earth. Quran also demonstrates the final messenger of Allah, Prophet Muhammad, as mercy for all creatures. Quran 21-107, as well as Uswatul Hasana for an excellent role model. Quran 33-21 for human civilization. From the Hadith, which is the compilation of narratives describing the sayings and the deeds of the Prophet, a number of examples can be applied in the context of present day ecological issues and sustainable consumption. For example, through the practices of the Prophet, also known as Sunnah, eating with three right fingers, Sahih Muslim number 2032, may help keep one's hands clean and healthy, prevent food contamination, limit food intake, improve digestion, avoid mouth and tongue burning, and so forth. In the context of sustainable consumption, this humble eating manner can help avoid using up disposable cutlery such as forks, spoons, and chopsticks, which can be toxic, non biodegradable, and raise concerns over forest depletion. In other examples, the Sunnah also inspires us to simply wear white, Sahih at Tirmidhi number 2810. Apart from purity, cleanliness, and comfort, it can also contribute to the environment positively by having less colored garments, as dyeing in the textile industry has been criticized for its chemical release, water consumption, and river pollution. Considering that the sustainability agenda at stake demands every individual's action for sustainable consumption, eco jihad, are striving for environmental cause, as initiated by young British blogger Zofishan Iqbal, may possibly be a way forward. Eco jihad can be in the form of active participation in social or economic activities that support environmental friendly lifestyles. It can also be in the passive form by practicing zuhud or asceticism, an antidote to materialistic or consumerism culture. Following the national effort to attain Maqasid Sharia or Islamic goals, the results are reported in the Malaysian Sharia Index published last year revealed The lowest score was obtained for the infrastructure and environmental component benchmark, 62.31%. Therefore, the environmental aspect definitely deserves priority, either from the perspective of Maqasid Sharia or sustainability development goals. As we aspire to be a high income nation, sustainable consumption can also play a role in mitigating the risks associated with high income society. For example, overconsumption and materialistic lifestyle. For Muslims, it is time to strengthen Habulum Minal Alam, or the relationship with nature through sustainable consumption. Odi Al Jayusi, professor and head of innovation at Arabian Gulf University in Bahrain, scholar in sustainable innovation, and a member of UN Global Scientific Advisory Panel for UN Environment's Global Environment Outlook 6, GEO 6, argues that Islamic worldview represents a unique model for a transition to sustainable development by focusing on justice, degrowth, and harmony between human and nature. He commented that Islam views the environmental challenges as an indicator for a moral and ethical crisis, looking at the creation of human and cosmos as signs of creator. Kitab Mentor uh, is a key in Islamic values. Professor Al-Jawsi elaborated that Islamic worldview defines a good life, hayat tayyiba, living lightly on earth, zuhud, and caring for both people and nature. Islamic discourse offers a sense of hope and optimism about the possibility of attaining harmony between human and nature. Earth will find a balance if humans rethink their lifestyles and mindsets as stated in the Quran. Corruption has appeared in both land and sea because of what people's own hands have brought, so that they may taste something of what they have done, so that hopefully they will turn back. Quran, ayat 30-41. Professor Al-Jawsi calls to retrieve the holistic view of Islam, which is founded on the notion of harmony and natural state fitra, and in respecting balance, mizan, and proportion, miqdar, in the systems of universe. These notions provide an ethical dimension and a mandate for all humans to respect nature in all forms of life. SDG 12 targets implement the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production. All countries taking action, with developed countries taking the lead, taking into account the development and capabilities of developing countries. By 2030, achieve sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. By 2030, halve per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer level, and reduce food losses along production and supply chain, including post-harvest losses. By 2020, achieve environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste throughout their life cycle in accordance with agreed international frameworks, and significantly reduce their release to air, water, and soil to minimize their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. By 2030, substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. Encourage companies, especially large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices and to integrate sustainability information into their reporting cycle. Promote public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities. By 2030, ensure that people everywhere have the relevant information and awareness for sustainable development and lifestyles in harmony with nature. Support developing countries to strengthen their scientific and technological capacities to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. Develop and implement tools to monitor sustainable development impacts for sustainable tourism, which creates jobs, promotes local culture and products. Rationalize inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption by removing market distortions in accordance with national circumstances, including by restructuring taxation and phasing out those harmful subsidies where they exist to reflect their environmental impacts, taking fully into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimizing the possible adverse impacts on their development in a manner that protects the poor and the affected communities. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my today's talk. I'm profoundly thankful to all of you for listening to me as well as passing my message to others. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow His guidance upon you all and grant you all what is best suited for you. Allah Hafiz, till next time.